um, find the screen that I want to share. There we go. And today I'm going to talk to you about every campus of refuge, which I know you know a little bit about, but I'm going to give you some more details. Let's see, slideshow. There we go. Okay. And apologies in advance if my screen freezes. Okay, it's showing up. Let me see. Can you still hear me, Sonalini?
I can. Yeah, we can
Okay.
see the screen yet, but
Yeah,
I can.
it takes a while for it to show up, but it just give it a second and hopefully that'll work. Oops. Sorry about that. Oop. And now I can't see anybody. So sorry. All right, let's try one more time. I should have done it differently. Usually if I share at the beginning and then stop, it remembers the command and works. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So today we're going to talk about every campus of refuge. And before I do that, I want to just give you some information that I'm sure you have heard many times already this semester, but bears repeating because the numbers are so staggering and because the information can sometimes be subject to confusion, especially the terms that we use. So, according to the UNHCR, the United Nations Commission on Higher Commission on Refugees, um, I'm sorry, that's misspelled. It should be UNHCR. There are nearly 80 million forcibly displaced individuals worldwide, and 26 million of those are refugees who are seeking resettlement. The majority of those refugees come from particular conflict zones, especially Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan, but there are many refugees who come from obviously elsewhere in the world and have been in refugee camps for quite a while. These are just the more recent displaced individuals or the most recent refugee populations. Um, 45 million of the forcibly displaced individuals are internally displaced. And I'll talk a little bit later about what those terms mean, but um, those are, that's a different category, a separate category. And then 4.2 million are asylum seekers. And those numbers are continually updated on the UNHCR website, which is the refugee resettlement arm of the United Nations. And you can find them at this link um, right here on the screen. Now, shockingly, alarmingly, even though the United States is one of the countries that resettles the some of the one of one of top three countries in terms of resettlement, we actually resettle less than half of 1% each year. Less now after the new historic lows in refugee admissions over the past few years under the Trump administration. But even in our heyday, when we were admitting 125,000 individuals annually, um, that was still a very, very small percentage. Um, and the reason being is that resettlement is a very specific thing, right? So when countries take in refugees who are coming from right next door, so my family are Palestinian, and they were Palestinian refugees in 1967, and they were displaced into Jordan and eventually became citizens. But many refugees who left Palestine and maybe went to Lebanon, went to Syria, and even went to Jordan, not all of them were given citizenship status, and many of them still live in refugee camps. Those cannot be counted as resettled refugees. Resettlement means full integration and citizenship, right? So it means that a refugee has been given access to live in another country and also contribute, participate, be integrated into that country, including rights and responsibilities. So many refugees who live in refugee camps elsewhere in the world are technically not resettled. That's why that number is so low. In other words, less than 1% of refugees each year um, come to the US and are resettled and are afforded a pathway to citizenship. We live in Greensboro, which is a huge refugee resettlement hub. Recent data that I looked at shows that Greensboro as a city is ranked 62 in this country in terms of refugee resettlement. And that includes a lot of cities, like in California and in New York, the big states that resettle refugees. But in terms of refugee resettlement, North Carolina itself is second to New York on the eastern seaboard in refugee admission and refugee resettlement. Under Obama, we welcomed annually between 2,000 and 3,000 refugees a year. And so, we've been doing just statewide a pretty good job in supporting refugee resettlement here in NC. In Greensboro specifically, we've been resettling refugees since the beginning of the Refugee Act in 1980. And the refugee populations here in Greensboro are from all over, but especially Vietnam and Cambodia, Bhutan, Burma, Iraq, Congo, Ethiopia, and many more. Every campus or refuge has worked mostly with families from East Africa and the Middle East, although most recently we hosted a family from Venezuela and Colombia, so our first South American family. Oops, sorry. I want to go back to the definition of refugee because it's really important. So a refugee is a very specific legal designation. And it's important because once a person has been designated as a refugee, then they get certain benefits that come with that status. So for example, if you're a refugee who's resettled in the US, that means that you get work authorization immediately, you get Medicaid, you get your social security number and a green card. And then after 5 years, you're eligible for citizenship. So a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee this is the UN definition, forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. There are two key things about refugees here. The first key thing is that a refugee cannot return to their country, right? That's what makes a refugee different, let's say, from a migrant. So even though migrants obviously refugees are migrants, but they're in the language of the UN and elsewhere, there are distinctions between various groups. And this concept of refoulement or non-refoulement, a refugee cannot return to their country safely. If they return to their country, they will be persecuted, they'll be killed, they'll be threatened. Whereas a migrant, let's say someone who's leaving because of environmental disasters or for better economic opportunities, they can return, right? All depends on your definition of safety and security. But the UN is very clear about that fear of persecution, that it has to be connected to one of 5 things that are named here. You can find this definition under unrefugees.org. What is a refugee? The current cap on refugee admission is 18,000. I think it was reduced to 15,000 under Trump. We're waiting on the presidential determination, which has not been issued yet. Not that I know of at least, but it should be much higher. Maybe 65,000, not as high as it used to be under Obama, because under Trump, the refugee resettlement program in the US has been significantly decimated, and we just don't have the capacity in this country to admit or accept 125,000 people. Any questions about the refugee definition? It's especially interesting, just as I sort of continue to think about how we define refugee, I'm always sort of struck by the UN definition. But are there any thoughts or questions about that particular definition? Yeah, Jihang?
Yeah, so the definition here reminds me a lot of the political asylees, uh, both left their country of origin and came to a different place. Both had fear of going back. So I do know that uh, for somebody to be a political asylee, you have to be here first and then apply. But refugees do not have to be here, right? They can be identified before they come here. So I wonder whether there are any other differences beyond this.
Sure, and I'll talk about the terms. Let me see if I have them here. So an asylum seeker is technically a refugee who has not proven yet that they are escaping for fear of their life. So an asylum seeker is someone who presents themselves at a border and says, I seek asylum. And then once their case has been proven, then they are given asylum. And in the case of refugees who are going from one country to another, they're given refugee status. But an asylum seeker is a step before refugee status, if that makes sense. So they both have the same, a refugee and an asylum seeker are really, as far as I understand it, is just a different step in that journey. And a refugee has, a person who has been given refugee status by the UN is someone who has shown that they cannot return to their country of origin. And it's a really involved process. If you remember when we talked about the literature a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the narrative that refugees have to constantly perform to prove to the person who's interviewing them that they cannot return to their country of origin. An asylum seeker has to do that to be able to be designated as someone who's deserving of asylum or as a refugee. So technically, Jihan, for all intents and purposes, there is no difference between asylum seeker and refugee in terms of why they're seeking refuge or why they're seeking sanctuary. The only difference is in their legal status and therefore the benefits that they get. So an asylum seeker does not get work authorization. An asylum seeker does not get a social security number. There are people who are sitting here waiting for their cases to be heard, and they don't have work authorization here in this country, and they don't have work authorization. They don't have a social security number. They don't have Medicaid. So the kinds of benefits that they get from the government is different. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so they don't have the benefits before their case is accepted, right?
Yes,
So if
yes.
Once their case is approved,
yes,
then they begin to have the benefits.
Exactly. Then they're no longer an asylum seeker. Then they've actually received asylum. Yeah. But an asylum seeker is just someone who's still trying to prove their case.
Will asylee, once accepted, will asylee continue to have a separate category from a refugee afterwards, or the two kind of merge?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that in the context of other countries. In the United States, refugees come to this country through a very specific process. It does not, you cannot become a refugee by seeking asylum in this country. So if you're coming from South America, let's say, and you present yourself at the southern border seeking asylum, then there's a process. Obviously, we know that that has not been followed, right? People are deported, people are detained, families are separated. There should be a process. It's a right. It's a human right and a political right to seek asylum. However, the refugee process in this country does not happen that way. Refugees are designated and identified in other countries, not at our southern, I mean, sometimes at our southern border, but very rarely. Most of them are coming from East Africa and the Middle East, and they are identified by agencies and contracted agencies by the United States elsewhere in other countries. And then those are selected for resettlement in the United States. So the pathway to this country for refugees is not like that for asylum seekers. A person cannot come here and say, I'm a refugee. They have to be accepted as a refugee elsewhere, and then they come here. Sonali, do you want to answer?
Thank you.
I just wanted to, I think this conversation was great. I also wanted to note that Allison had her hand up a little while ago, and I wondered if she had a question or would like a point of clarification.
I actually had like a similar question, but then another question that came up for me is kind of like, how do like refugees or like asylum seekers themselves like self-identify? do they think of themselves in these terms, or are there like other terms that they find like more appropriate? I don't know if you know that or
Yeah. Um, that's a, I mean, obviously, with 70 million people who are forcibly displaced, you'll find 70 million ways in which people self-define and identify. And so I can't speak for the, I can't generalize, but I will say that these designations are legal designations or bureaucratic designations, right? So it's what the US uses to designate people who are coming into this country as refugees or who are seeking asylum. It's what the UN uses. Um, and so refugees that I know of will sometimes use those terms because those are the terms that they see in the forms, or those are the terms that they have used in the process of presenting themselves as refugees seeking resettlement. And of course, these words depend on the language that the person uses. And so the words, for example, do exist in Arabic for refugee, laji. But lots of Palestinians that I know, including my family, don't necessarily think of themselves as refugees. They think of them. They use different terms that speak to displacement and migration. But because refugee is a very specific legal designation, it's the one that we use here to talk about a specific population that comes to this country with particular rights. So I've put on the slide here several of the terms that usually come up. So refugee, we've talked about. Again, it's a very specific term that describes a people, individuals who have presented themselves at a border and seek asylum and say, we're escaping because of conflict. We cannot return to our country because we fear for our lives. And then they might stay in a camp for a while, and then they, go through a process with the United Nations and await resettlement somewhere. But not all refugees are resettled, right? The majority of refugees are not resettled. The majority of refugees languish in refugee camps for generations. An immigrant is someone who moves from one place to another for a variety of reasons. All refugees are immigrants, but not all immigrants are refugees. An immigrant is, again, it can be anybody who moves for any reason from one place to another. The implication in the term immigrant is that it's a permanent move, right? So someone who leaves their country, emigrates, and then lives in another country, immigrates, becomes an immigrant permanently. So Nalini and Jihong know that for some reason, white people, this term does not apply to white people who immigrate. They call them expatriates. So, it's an interesting distinction that we make. Immigrant for me seems to suggest particular racial categories, Black and brown people who move. White people who are immigrants, or, there are some white groups who are racialized as non-white. So historically, if we think of the Irish or if we think of the Italian, but people like let's say Americans, white Americans who leave the US to go work in Europe, like nobody calls them immigrants, call them something else. So it's interesting to think about how we understand human mobility and human movement, and how we understand who's allowed to move and who's not allowed to move. The term expatriate is interesting because it centers the place which you left. Expat quite literally means, to leave the patria, to leave your homeland, someone who has left. An immigrant is someone who has entered. And so this centers the place that you're going to. Expat centers the place that you left. And so, we can talk more about the ideologies behind that, but it's an interesting distinction. Migrant suggests someone who's also moving, another body on the move, but more transient, right? So maybe not permanent movement from one place to another. Maybe it's episodic, looking for particular kinds of labor. Maybe someone who moves from place to another, escaping conflict, or is looking for job opportunities, or escaping environmental disasters. Displaced is someone who does not or cannot live in their place of origin. Internally displaced means that you're still in your country, but you're just not in your town. You're not in your village. You're not in your city. You've had to move somewhere else in your country. So a displaced individual is someone like a refugee, like an asylum seeker, but they haven't left their country. They're internally displaced. And an asylum seeker is someone who is trying to seek legal status in another country for protection, right, from persecution. There are different legal avenues for all of these different visas. There's a particular kind of refugee visa, for example, called the special immigrant visa, SIV. And usually that is a special refugee status that's afforded to nationals of countries who are persecuted because they collaborated with the US government. So translators, interpreters, contractors who might have worked with the US government in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam, those individuals qualify for the special immigrant visa. Any questions about these terms?
I just, if I could just add, you know, in India, there's a significant migrant labor force that has moved from India to the Middle East, and I think the countries that I'm most aware of is like Qatar and like the United Arab Emirates, and it's these countries seem to have like a two-tiered kind of system of citizenship where these migrant laborers have worked there for several years, like, you know, in some cases like decades, but as migrant labor, but they're not necessarily eligible for citizenship. And that's the way the countries have set up their kind of citizenship hierarchy. But in India, the remittances that these migrant laborers send back home, it's like one of the top five like GDP like contributions to India's GDP, the level of remittances or the amount of remittances that these migrant laborers send back to India. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out as an example of migrant labor.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And not just Qatar, but all of the Gulf really exploits laborers from other parts of the Middle East, like Egypt, for example. There are lots of Egyptian day laborers, especially men, but also really indentured servanthood, right? So lots of women from the Philippines, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, who are working as what's the word, like when you're in the home, housekeepers.
Domestic workers.
Say that again. Oh, domestic. Is it what's it called?
Domestic workers.
Domestic workers for incredibly, and they hold on to their passports. Like the family will hold on to the person's passport because they don't. I mean, the situations are so the circumstances are so sometimes so abhorrent that you know, obviously those migrant laborers and migrant workers cannot tolerate them, and so to ensure that they're not escaping, they hold on to their passports so that they can't. And so it's you know, they're called migrant laborers, but really, for all intents and purposes, the way it's working out is it's really indentured servanthood or worse. Let's see. Any questions about these terms? Any other terms that you've heard that you want me to clarify? Okay, great. So I want to talk about Every Campus a Refuge and sort of how Every Campus a Refuge came about. So I talked a little bit about my background. I am a Palestinian. My parents are Palestinian refugees. They were displaced in the Arab-Israeli, the occupation of Israel of Palestine in 1967. And they came to Jordan, so they crossed the river and were displaced in Jordan and lived in refugee camps for a while. And there, you know, that experience, especially of my parents and my grandmother, of being refugees and what it's like to be a refugee in Jordan and to feel displaced and lack of integration and lack of belonging is a formative part of my growing up and my experience. And so that played a part in sort of my wanting to explore the ways in which communities can provide greater hospitality and support to newcomers. And then in 2015, after the sort of much what's the word, talked about. I mean, the Syrian refugee crisis had been going on since 2011, but in 2015, we had been hearing about how many Syrian refugees had been perishing in their journey, trying to escape the violence in Syria, trying to get to Europe, trying to get to, different countries in Europe, whether it's Greece or Turkey, and then up into Germany. And then that one particular incident of Aylan Kurdi, the 4-year-old boy who drowned, that really shook the world in powerful ways. At that time, Pope Francis called on every parish in Europe to host a refugee family. And I thought that that was a really interesting idea to think about the ways in which small communities can do their part in this quote unquote radical hospitality, which is an idea that's really germane to lots of faith traditions, that communities should open up their resources themselves, their spaces to welcome the stranger, to embrace the stranger. That's radical hospitality. And so when the Pope said that, I thought, oh, like a college or university campus is exactly, it's exactly like a parish. We're a small city, a small community. We have the same kind of resources, the same kind of facilities, and we have similar community functions, right? We're varied, we're multiple, we're connected to each other by values. So we're exactly like the small city. I was like, okay, well, if every parish can and should host a refugee family, why can't every campus in the world host a refugee family? And so that's where that idea came from. But also, you all are at Guilford College, and you know that we have a really interesting history, especially as part of the Underground Railroad, of supporting folks, opening up our support, our resources to support folks who are escaping miserable conditions into the unknown, right? And so, if you recall the stories around the Underground Railroad, is that escaping enslaved individuals would hide in the Guilford woods, and then the Quakers would smuggle them up north. And so there was something about Guilford's history that I think dovetailed nicely with this 21st century iteration of supporting folks who are trying to seek refuge in our midst. I was also really inspired by the Quaker testimonies, but especially the Quaker testimony of stewardship. And stewardship is using our resources in ways that align with our values. For me, it means, how do we use our resources in ways that are aligned with justice, with social justice, and with equity. And so how could we be good stewards of our college resources, right? Our housing, our clinics, our facilities, our utilities, all of those things. How can we use them in ways that align with our ethos and our social justice values? Any questions about this before I move on?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was like the process for executing ECAR? Like, what all did you have to do to actually make it a program at Guilford?
Yeah. So the first thing I did was I went to the president at the time was Jane Fernandez, and I said, Jane, I have this idea, which is really sort of a very basic idea. We know that Greensboro hosts refugees or welcomes refugees annually. We're one of the refugee resettlement hubs in the country. Why don't we use a campus house that nobody's using at the moment to host a refugee family and offer them resettlement support? And Jane said very quickly, yes. It was not even a discussion, honestly. So I know we've had our challenges with our former president, but I will say that in this instance, and this was very early, this was her first semester. I think if I caught her in her second year, she might have said no, but she was really still excited about Guilford and about who we were. And so she said yes. And so the process from then on was really just getting community buy-in. So once Jane said yes, and we kind of identified a house, we had lots of conversations on campus, film screenings, information sessions. We brought in our refugee resettlement agency partners, Church World Service, to talk about what it would look like to host refugees on our campus and what we would need to do. And so the first step was getting buy-in from the administration. And then the second step was partnering with CWS, our refugee resettlement agency partner, to sort of design this hosting initiative. And then after that, again, it was just a lot of conversations with the community, getting buy-in from volunteers, from departments, from programs, and our volunteer base grew over time. They're the ones who helped us set up the house and host families, and we formalized slowly over the course of the last. I would say we started in 2015. We hosted our first refugee individual single case in January of 2016, and our first Syrian family in 2016, March 2016. That initial period, we were just figuring out how we were going to do this to the best of our abilities. And we currently have a best practices manual where we actually tell folks what process to follow to get their campuses to be an ECAR campus. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, it's a picture of my grandma. I like showing her picture. She's the one holding the bowl because, I think of sort of my background and my experience, and really it's just a lot of it is grounded in the kind of lessons and narratives that I heard from her. And so this is the picture that we took in September of 2015 when Jane said, sure, yeah, you can have a house on campus to host a refugee family. We put out a call in a faculty meeting saying, if you're interested, if you want to know about this, if you want to be a part of this, we're going to have a meeting. And so we did. And then we took this picture. And you'll notice so many beautiful people who are no longer with us in this picture. There's Jeff Jeske, but there's Jim, like right in the center, our current president. It's great. Let's see. Are any of you, is anybody in this call? Shihong, are you here? Who else is here? There's Dave Dobson. There's Dave Limburg.
No, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you
I
recognize
was on
anybody.
leave that
You were on
year.
leave. Yeah.
So I wasn't on campus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lots of wonderful students. These are students from 2015. There's Olivia Chalkley. There's Karen Spira in the middle. Yeah. Oh, there's Milen, Don Smith. Anyway, I love looking at this picture. It reminds me of I think of it as the golden age, but I'm sure it's not the golden age of Guilford. Anyway, so at its core, every campus of refuge is a radical reimagining of how campus space and resources, and I really define resources as innovatively, as nimbly, as flexibly as possible. Everything is a resource. Everything is an asset, human, material, ideological, whatever it is, within and without, because I don't think of Guilford College as ending at, Friendly Avenue and New Garden Avenue. That to me is not Guilford College. Guilford College, our friends, community members, local partner organizations, our alumni, our parents, everybody who is in any way connected to Guilford College is part of the resources that I call myself a hacker. It's really a fancy term. Also a hustler. Both of them is just me trying to figure out who has what and how can I get it. And so that's kind of how ECAR works, is we identify the resources that collectively at our disposal and thinking creatively about how we can use those resources. But the goal is to use them to support refugees and provide a softer landing and a stronger beginning. That's our mission: softer landing, stronger beginning for refugees resettling in the United States. The reason for that being is that we have a refugee resettlement program, but it's got a hard landing and a pretty weak beginning. So what I mean by that is, let me see, there's someone in the...
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, I just to your last point, I love this term from your article.
Yes.
Asset-based community of practice.
Asset-based community of practice. Yes. Like we get together and we do something and we all bring our assets. And these assets, again, they don't have to be material, right? You might be someone who's great at drawing. I can use your skills. You might be someone who's great at writing. You might be someone who's great at fundraising. You might be someone who does excellent tutoring, so assets here is broadly defined as skills, passions, interests, all of that. But I don't know if you know this, but when refugees resettle in the US, and I don't know if I can talk about the nitty gritty, if that's okay. So when refugees are resettled in the US, each refugee individual is given about $1,000. That's a one-time stipend. And that $1,000 is supposed to go towards paying for rent, your security deposit, your furniture, your food, everything, right? So it's part of this program, the reception and placement program. And because the stipend is so limited, the expectation is that you're going to start funding your resettlement, you're funding your life here in the US pretty quickly. In fact, the refugee and resettlement program in the US has a 90-day expectation for self-sufficiency, which means that folks who arrive are expected to become financially self-sufficient in 90 days. I want you to imagine that. 90 days. 90 days. That's less than a semester. You land, you're a traumatized individual, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be a refugee. By definition, refugee is someone who has escaped death by the skin of their teeth and are trying to protect their children from the same fate. You might not be proficient in English. You speak other languages, right? But you might not be proficient in English. You're arriving in a new country with nothing. And you're expected to adjust so quickly that you can find a job, get childcare for your kids, learn the language, and become independent in 90 days. Like if I put any one of you in another country where you don't speak the language and I say, go make a doctor's appointment. I mean, it might take you longer than 3 months to figure that out. You know, it's tough. It's tough. And so what ECAR tries to do is tries to intervene in that and provide a more holistic integration experience so that refugees get more support at the beginning, no financial stress, right? Because every campus of refuge provides free rent, free utilities for several months so folks can save that stipend and then figure out where they'd like to live in Greensboro. Now, that's another thing that's really interesting about the refugee resettlement program. It's not the fault of the refugee resettlement program. I want to be very clear. Our refugee resettlement agency partners are fantastic. CWS is incredible. They're doing great work with limited resources. It's the system. It's the system that is problematic. And so what happens is that the refugee resettlement agency tries to secure housing for a family. When the family arrives, they take them immediately to that housing. And what ends up is that the family ends up living in that housing for a long time. It might not be the housing that they want. It might not be in the area they want to live in Greensboro. And so one of the things that we try to do is also give folks an opportunity to learn what Greensboro is, where they'd like to be in Greensboro. Another thing that's is very, very tough is that, as you know, refugees, when they arrive, they have not yet secured their social security number. They get that very quickly, but when they arrive, they still don't have paperwork. They still don't have, I mean, you know, so landlords don't want to rent out to people who don't have credit backgrounds and don't have social security numbers. Guess who ends up renting to people that they can't prove anything about? Like who can you imagine are the landlords who are like, yeah, sure, we'll do that?
Like the ones that have really unsafe conditions.
Exactly. The slumlords who are like, yeah, sure, whatever. Because those folks won't know anything about tenant rights, right? And so I think the system really facilitates ghettoization, you know, to ghettoize people and generational poverty. And so one of the things that we try to do at ECAR is really intervene in that process and to create a situation where folks can thrive and not just survive, right? You get 5 to 8 months where you just learn what Greensboro is, what the city is about. Where would you like to live? You know, find a job, get your kids situated. And then folks move out, you know, between the 5 and 8 month period. Any questions before I move on to the next slide? And I'm mindful that at 3, we're going to take a 10-minute break or a 15-minute break.
Maybe like 10 minutes.
10, okay. So we have been hosting folks since January of 2016. So far, we've hosted 60. 29 of those have been kids. They've come from all over the countries. We've hosted families as large as 11 and 9. And it's so wonderful because, as you can imagine, these are multi-generational families, right? With grandmas and grandpas and children and grandchildren. We've hosted single cases, so young men, especially members of the LGBTQ community. Families stay in houses on our campus and sometimes in apartments, never in dorms. It's very important. They stay in discrete apartments or homes that have their own washer and dryer, their own bathrooms, their own entrance, all of that. And that's obviously a humane requirement, but it's also a requirement of refugee resettlement agencies here in the US that refugees have to be hosted in homes, right? They're not sharing their space or amenities with students. As I said, we partner with a refugee resettlement agency partner. In this case, it's CWS Greensboro, and we set up the house according to their standards and beyond. They give us a list for every family that says, okay, you're going to be hosting 5 people. So this is what you need to have at minimum in the house. We always have way above and beyond that through in-kind donations. And every family that leaves our campus takes all of that furniture with them. So we start fresh with every family that arrives. The folks that we host on our campus stay between 3 and 8 months. The average is 5 months. And while they're on campus, we support, do case management, everything that you can imagine, through our volunteers. And we have lots of volunteers. They're trained and they're vetted. And then we support the family in finding off-campus housing. ECAR always pays the first month's rent and the security deposit and the utilities set up for those families. I'm going to stop here because I was going to talk about other families or like specific families. So I don't want to interrupt that. Any questions before, when you want me to go ahead and start? I think we'll just maybe wait to see people's faces.
I think the only one, and maybe Allison might be. I saw Allison like a minute ago. So if you wanted to just go ahead and get started, Diya, I think that would be okay.
Sounds good. And I have a meeting at 3, but it's from my Zoom, and so I have to log in. Do you mind if we log off at 2:50 today?
I think that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right. So I wanted to share with you just some of the stories of the families that we have hosted on our campus. These pictures have been taken with their consent, and they know that we're sharing their stories. So this is the Iraqi family that we hosted on our campus. This is the mom, Marwa, and the kids, Ahmed, Yusuf, and Aboudi. I feel like you've met them, Sonalini. They live next door now.
That's right. I think I met the kids. Yeah, I don't know if I met the adults.
Yeah, they come and play every day.
Oh, and I think I might have met them at a splash pad last year, like before COVID, like probably the year before then.
Yeah, yeah. They arrived in March of 2017, so they've been here for 4 years exactly, and they have just had a baby in May, Adam. So there's now 4 boys in the family. Very recently, they bought a house, which is, I think, sort of a testament to the incredible resourcefulness and resilience of folks, but also the way in ways in which ECAR can actually support folks in their early days so that they are more able to be financially successful later on. And so I think this is a really powerful example of that. But as I said, they're a family from Iraq, and they arrived 4 years ago. This is Blaze. Blaze is from Burundi, and he's an incredible singer and songwriter. I don't know if you've heard Blaze play the guitar or sing, but he's wonderful. And we also hosted him on our campus for a few months in, I think, 2019. This is the Haberaruma family. They're from the DRC, and they're 2 children and the mom and the dad, but they're older kids who had come in earlier to the US because they're adults. They were under their own resettlement cases. And so the way that refugee resettlement works is that families are resettled as a unit. But if somebody is independent, like a son, and they have their own family, then they're a separate unit and they get resettled separately. So they were actually joining a son who was here, had arrived before them. And so they have since moved, I think they moved last year to Tennessee to also follow the son who moved to Tennessee. Um, there are a couple of interesting, I want to, go back to talk about a sort of a couple of things that are of note in these particular families' experiences. So Ali, and he's the father in this family, the father in the Iraqi family, works at Tyson. And lots of newcomers, refugees especially, end up working in meat processing plants. And I don't know if you remember what happened with COVID, um, but there were lots of outbreaks at the meat processing plants for a variety of reasons, mostly because people are working in such close proximity. They're carpooling together. The health and safety precautions in those processing plants are really hard to keep up. And because lots of folks from the immigrant and refugee communities can't self-isolate. Like if somebody gets sick, like where are they going to go, right? It's not, self-isolation in this case is not possible. They're also multi-generational families. And so there are elders in the family who might get sick. And so, as you know from Kelsey's talk, the immigrant and refugee community was hit really hard by COVID-19. Yusuf, the 6-year-old, well, he's 7 now, got very, very sick with COVID. Everybody in the family got it, but Yusuf had a severe case and he was hospitalized and had to be transferred to the ICU in Chapel Hill. And it was horrific for 8 days because we didn't know if he was going to make it. He was in the ICU in Chapel Hill. His mom could not see him for the whole time because they would only allow one family member, which was his dad. And she had just had a baby. So the baby was a month old when this happened. And really, it was just sort of a living example of how challenging it is to be working in certain conditions and to be experiencing the medical system as a refugee, and to be experiencing the medical system as a refugee under pandemic conditions. Anyway, it laid bare lots of things that were problematic about the ways in which refugee and immigrant communities are treated in this country and the challenges and obstacles that they face. But Yusuf is doing great now. He's going to come over at 3:30, and we love seeing him every day. So Blaze is also, again, another, I mean, they're all incredible cases, but when we say that the system here is not set up for success, that's another example of, someone who comes in with incredible skills, passions, abilities. And, I mean, again, he's a singer-songwriter, but he has to work at the factories, right? The meat processing plants. One of the things that Blaze has managed to do is also work as a translator and interpreter because he speaks multiple languages. This particular family's situation is also noteworthy. When they moved off our campus, they followed their son who was living at the Summit and Cone apartments. So they were there in 2018 when the fire happened. They were the next door neighbors of the 5 children who died in that fire. I remember we helped them move in, and those kids came out and helped us unpack the stuff from the van. That Summit and Cone fire, I don't know if you all remember it at all, in 2018. It really shook the community and again laid bare the housing conditions in the city. The fire happened because of a faulty oven. And folks have been trying to tell the property management about the situation with no response. When they did an investigation of the Summit and Cone apartments, they found thousands and thousands of health code violations. The family that owns that property management, they still own other properties. They're still doing their thing in Greensboro. So fair housing, fair, safe, affordable housing is a really important issue. If y'all are looking for things to be involved in, to be invested in, housing is key. And that's why ECAR's contribution, its biggest contribution, is safe, free housing for newcomers. This is Ali. He's the father in the Iraqi family. And Ali is an artist and a calligraphist. And again, when you come to this country, this expectation of just take the first job that you get means that most people can't get recertified. They can't actually get jobs that are commensurate with their skills and their certifications and their degrees. He has a bachelor's degree in art, in two kinds of art, on textile and arabesque and calligraphy. But being on a college campus, we were able to provide him with campus resources like an art department, supplies, space, studio, and then we exhibited his work on our campus, which again, just shows you the variety that's available on a college campus, right? That we not only have housing, but we have art departments and we have art supplies and we have a gallery. That's all part of the assets that we have on that campus. This is some of Ali's work.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to ask very quickly, what is his job now after the initial difficulty?
No, he's
what
still
kind of job has he landed on?
He's working at Tyson, but he does art on the side. So he supplements with creating artwork. The Tyson positions are, attractive because the pay is decent and because there's opportunity for overtime. Yeah. Anyway, so this is some of his artwork. The piece on the right says Guilford College in Arabic. It's really beautiful. I have the original in my Guilford College office. That's some more of his work. This is a Quranic ayah. Okay, so the way Every Campus a Refuge works is that we really try to steward every available resource. And so when we're talking about campus resources, just think about really the variety, the enormity, I mean, just the number of resources that we have. So we have available and empty housing, and we try to take advantage of that as much as possible. Sometimes we've hosted two families at the same time. In one case, we've actually hosted 3 cases at the same time, 2 families in a single case, because we had one of the RA suites that were empty. And so we were able to host Chris there. And then Jennifer's family, the Habaruma family, and the Iraqi family, they were living across the street from each other in 2 faculty houses. We're able to use our art studios, our space and art galleries, the cafeteria. The single cases that we host on our campus really enjoy meeting students because they're about the same age. And so I always get them a meal plan from Meriwether Godsey. And, just when you think about it, on their budget, Meriwether Godsey, like 1 meal plan is nothing on their budget. It's a blip on their budget. But for a newcomer who's trying to save that stipend, 3 meals a day for 4 months is incredible. We also, take advantage of any available furniture. When people say, hey, I'm getting rid of my office couch. If it's in good condition, we can use that. My favorite story is when Rhonda Johnson, who's our fantastic public safety officer, came to me one day and said, I have several bikes that we have found on campus. Nobody wants them anymore. Do y'all need them? They're great bikes. They're working. I'm like, of course. And so that's one of the things now that we do is that we provide a bike for every family member. It's not only great for the kids who can bike around campus, but it's really great for mobility until families are able to get driver's licenses, so folks to be able to get around. Bikes are a good thing. We also provide guests with access to our college facilities, whether it's the gym or the library, classes. They're welcome to attend classes. Wi-Fi is expensive, so having free Wi-Fi is really key. And the CSA at the farm, they always give us vegetables whenever they have them for our families, so that's really great. We also partner with off-campus folks. As I said, when we think about resources, we think very broadly, within and without, inside and out. And so Deep Roots Market, our local co-op, they provide the first 2 weeks of groceries for free for every family that we host. We partner with Early College at Guilford, who fundraise for us, who get us books, who get us, I mean, they're great. They're wonderful for in-kind donations. We partner with meeting houses who also provide funds. We partner with New Arrivals Institute, who train our students to provide ESL instruction. We partner with First Presbyterian Church, who gave us tuition-free preschool spots in their daycare. One of the things that we don't have in this country is free daycare, which is, if you've lived in other places, you're like, oh, how does that work? How do people get to have jobs if they need to pay to take care of their kids? So yeah, so that's really important, when you're trying to make your life for yourself, which depends very much on financial success, and you have 3 children under the age of 5, how are you supposed to be able to find a job if childcare is unaffordable? Did you want to say something, Sonalini?
Oh no, I was just curious that just in terms of maybe for students who might be interested in kind of building these partnerships or coalitions in the future, did you build on existing relationships you had with
Yes, it's always somebody who knows somebody. It's such an Arab system.
okay.
No, seriously, it works because Quakers are very similar that way. It's like, oh, I know some. At the time, Hallie was working there. Hallie, the ECAR program coordinator, she was working at First Presbyterian Church, and she said, "Oh, we have this program on campus. Can you all give us tuition-free, spots?" And they're like, "Yeah." So we just ask. This is my rule. This is the hustler rule. Ask, because what's the worst that can happen? They just say no. Just ask the next person. Yes, so it's all relational. It's all about building relationships, reaching out, and we welcome any effort. Anybody who says, hey, I've got a friend at X, Y, or Z place. Maybe we can work something out. Yeah, that's the best way. We also partner with Newcomer School. Newcomer School, if you all know, they're at the end of the road on Friendly. And they're actually a school dedicated. It's a dedicated transitional schools for the children of refugees and immigrants, which is remarkable. It's remarkable that we have a school that its purpose is to act as a transitional school for newcomer kids. And so the bus actually comes on campus. Sorry, the newcomer bus comes on campus and picks up the kids and takes them to newcomer school. But you have to be obviously in kindergarten or first grade.
Do they also exempt the tuition free for the refugee kids?
Oh, it's a public school. Newcomer School is a public school. It's a GCS
I thought
school.
You were talking about the Newcomer Friends School.
No. The Newcomer School. It's the Doris Henderson Newcomer School. It's a Guilford County school. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's a public school.
Okay. I thought you were talking about New Garden Friends School. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
No, yeah. New Garden Friends School, they help us with like fundraising and in-kind donations. We get a lot of just support from schools like that, getting their students mobilized to raise funds and donations. So our volunteers do quite a bit. And so if you're interested in volunteering, here are some of the things that you would be doing. You would set up the house, you would collect donations and help raise funds. We do airport welcome. We provide transportation until folks are oriented to the bus routes in Greensboro. We provide ESL instruction and tutoring. We provide interpretation, we share meals. The cultural brokering and orientation part is a really big part of what we provide. I think having a community support in the form of a Guilford College, an entire college, form of Guilford College, that entire community, that's really supportive of sort of holistic integration of newcomers. Here are some pictures. I don't know if you recognize some of these beautiful faces. That's Christy Shamas all the way to the left. We were welcoming a guest from the Sudan. That's Robin Bigage. That's Kate Hood, Jimhud's sister. And that's Doha. Doha is a caseworker from CWS. She's the caseworker for the guest that we were welcoming at that time. More people. There's Kathleen. There's Riri. We were welcoming a guest from the DRC. Might have been Blaze, but I can't be sure. All right. And this one's really powerful. This was last March, a week before the shutdown. I don't know if you recognize the children from the Iraqi family there. So that was March of last year. Aboudi, Ahmad, and Yusuf, who's hiding behind them somewhere, had arrived 3 years prior. So they were 3 years almost to the day, had come in that through that same airport. And then there are my two daughters up front, and there's Karen Spira and her kids. Anyway, it felt like a really powerful sort of cycle of welcome. So having sort of immigrants and refugees welcome the newest family who had children at the airport, that was really powerful. Our volunteers also help with creating herb gardens like this one and playing soccer. This is the International Student Club. They have pickup soccer every Friday, and Jacob loved playing with them. This is Amelia, one of our fantastic ECAR students in the minor, and also a volunteer helping Jennifer with online learning. Or I think she was doing tutoring, but and there's Kathleen helping Afia with forms. Everybody needs help with forms. And as you can imagine, they're incredibly laborious. So just, providing social support. I am going to pivot now to talk about the teaching component of Every Campus a Refuge and talk about, the new ways in which I'm trying to understand and frame ECAR and the work that we do. And so I want to pause here to talk about a teaching experience that I had last year at Guilford. I was teaching, and I teach all the time, African women writers, Arab women writers, Arab and Islamic feminisms. And I was teaching African women writers at the time. And I put it this way because I'm a brown teacher who teaches Black students, but teaches predominantly in white spaces. And so one of the students provided this really incredible feedback about how problematic it is to continue to talk about tragic things that face Black and brown folks, especially, obviously in the context of African women writers, we were talking about texts that spoke to colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, sexism, capitalism, all of the oppressive systemic things, ideologies, discourses, and how difficult it is to talk about that and sort of put that on display, like the tragic aspects of Black and brown experiences in white spaces, that teaching tragedy is problematic unless you teach it in a particular way. And so this particular student was, she left this in the comments, but also talked to me in class about it, and talked about, how hard it is to talk about these issues and to discuss these issues with white students in the same space. And so I realized that that's what I do all the time, right? I teach, talk about, engage trauma-informed narratives constantly. Sonalini and Jihang, I'm sure, will appreciate this, right? We sort of grew up in the best tradition. We're sort of the same generation. And when we were up and coming in our graduate studies, we were all like the Paulo Freire, like pedagogy of the oppressed, right? Like we were reacting to a generation of professors who had canonized whiteness, right? And so here we are, like, we're going to teach the Indian women writers, and we're going to teach the African women writers, and we're going to teach and we're going to uplift those voices, even if those voices are filled with pain, because that's the truth, that's real, right? And so for the longest time, my teaching had focused on uplifting, on highlighting, on magnifying, right? And recognizing that I was definitely, as a teacher in the West, because I had taught in Jordan, right? as a teacher in the West that I was teaching under Western eyes, to borrow one of my favorite feminists' phrases, Talpade Mohanty, Chantrak Talpade Mohanty, that so much of the work that we do is under Western eyes, especially in the West, as academics of color, as women of color. We operate under Western eyes. In academia, which is predominantly white, even if you're surrounded by people of color, the systems are white. But what that was doing was that I felt from clearly that student's comment, but also the reality was that we were promoting a culture of fetishization in class discussions, where we were bearing these traumas to be looked at, to be gazed at, a spectacle. And so I realized that I wasn't just teaching under Western eyes, I was teaching for Western eyes. And that was hard, it was really heavy, sort of to think about my teaching that had to be different, right? I had to think about accountability. How am I accountable as an instructor to the students in the classroom who are Black and brown? How am I accountable as an institution to refugees coming into this country, so that it's no longer simply about uplifting, right? For me, they're two different things. And I mentioned this in a Facebook post, so I'm going to say it again here, that it's one way to think about every campus of refuge as radical hospitality, right? Radical hospitality means we're good people. We're so good, we're hospitable. We open up our arms, but it still sets us up as the what? Like the do-gooders, right? The ones who get to be charitable, the ones who get to be at the center. But what if we reframe it as radical accountability? We don't do it because we're good people. We do it because we have to do it, because our country's politics have actually displaced people around the world, and now we're accountable to that. And so I had to think about my teaching as sort of to reframe my teaching, that it's not simply about uplifting, but accountability to the experiences of Black and brown students in the classroom, but also to the experiences of the refugees that we would be hosting. I'm going to pause here on this line because I really like it. That pedagogy of the oppressed is no longer enough. This Paulo Freire is sort of focusing on the voices of the oppressed. That's no longer enough. That we need a pedagogy of accountability. So I'm going to pause here and see if folks have any questions or thoughts, or this is sort of ideologically, pedagogically complicated stuff. So I'm curious to see what Sonali and Jihong think, my fellow women of color teachers. Or if you've had similar experiences in the classroom. I think I've been feeling this a lot at Guilford in the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, Diya, I really like how you articulated these feelings. Those are very subtle and it's hard to describe. And I certainly feel the same. In my little world, I always feel that there is a lot of interest among students about just cute Oriental things, a manga or samurai or kind of fantasized, romanticized topics. And when we talk about heavier stuff, those are less popular and students are less interested. And at the same time, yeah, it does feel a little bit uncomfortable to talk about suffering and tragedies of Asians to a Western audience. And I really like how you characterized. I really like your language here. You said it the best.
Thank you. So Nalin, did you want to add anything? Thank you, John.
Yeah, I really love the nuances, and I love the shift that you're making. Yeah, I guess in terms of like on the ground, like what would this look like? What would a pedagogy of accountability look like? Would you teach different authors? Would you yourself teach differently? Yeah, like how do you see it working
Yeah.
Like I love the, but how would it work in practice?
Yeah. And so in literature classes, it worked differently. In Every Campus a Refuge, the minor, it was very clear that that accountability would have to focus on how we centered, who was centered and who was decentered in the learning experience, right? And so I'll talk about that here. So for me, institutional accountability means that we recognize that Guilford College needs to do this not because we're good people, but because we're accountable, right? So that shift is important. So as opposed to charity, how do we think of this as responsibility, right? We're part of systems that have displaced people and made them refugees. So we have to do this, not we want to do this. We want to, but we also need to, we have to. And so for me, the pedagogy of accountability looks like centering the needs and lived experiences of the guests that we would be hosting on our campus. In other words, I tell students, I tell them, you know, eCar was never for or about you as a student, never. I mean, I love you and I want you to learn, but not at the expense of people that we would be hosting on our campus. You're here to do a job. You're here to take someone to the DSS and help them fill out their form. You're not supposed to take pictures along the way. You're not supposed to post them on Facebook and then talk about, you know, how transformative this experience was for you. It's not about you. And so, you know, constantly centering that, but also making sure that it's centered in the curricular component so that the pedagogy itself centered the folks that we would be hosting. So here I want to talk very quickly about those because we've only got 9 minutes. So I designed 2 minors with the support of Sonalini and Jahang, who were involved in offering courses that satisfied these minors. And Sonalini played a big role in this because this is a CPPS minor, both of them. And so folks who minored in Every Campus a Refuge or Forced Migration and Resettlement Studies took 4 courses. They had to take 4 courses. 1 course where they learned about forced migration and resettlement studies or resettlement. 1 course where they centralized the voice and perspectives of refugees and immigrants. So this is an example, a good example of pedagogy of accountability. So we never, ever exploit the folks that we host on our campus for their voices and their experiences and their perspectives, right? Like we're not asking them to fill in that learning gap that we have. So the folks that we host on our campus are not resources to be mined for our students' learning. We get at centralizing in different ways. We read literature, we engage with Natakallam, that's a nonprofit that pairs language learners with displaced individuals. The folks that we host on our campus are not there for us to learn from. They're there for us to host and support them as much as possible, right? So that's really important. And then students also take a course on how to build community and advocacy and organizing. And then they take the eCar course where they engage in Natakallam, where they take action by hosting folks on our campus and supporting them in their resettlement, and where they design and implement a project that supports refugee resettlement. But in all of that, pedagogically, it's very clear in the design of the curriculum, in the syllabi, in the assignments, that the expectation is that the folks that we host on our campus are not a learning tool. They are not a learning tool. And so that was really key in terms of that accountability. In terms of teaching literature classes, I really got to a point where it was, you know, presentations were going to look different, right? Having Black or brown students present in front of white students, you know, seeing the ways in which, you know, I would shift that so that we would have different spaces. I left Guilford before that actually happened. And so I didn't get a chance to test it out to see what it would look like to have students present and have the white students, you know, either not be there, and I don't know what that would have looked like, or have them be there and, you know, have to respond in certain ways, or maybe design the class seating in such a way that centered the students of color in the classroom, monitoring who was speaking when and how much space we were giving to certain people in class versus how little. So those are all techniques that I didn't get a chance to live out or experience in my African woman writers class because I never taught it again. But those were some of the strategies that I was toying with, was really just working on space in the classroom, and who can talk when, and it was all just experimental at that point. Here are some pictures of me and my students taking the bus downtown, and to get used to the bus system so that they can be volunteers and teach folks how to use the bus. Students are involved in lots of other ways in eCar, especially by creating artwork and promotional material and podcasts. Here's some artwork by one of our students who graduated. Another thing that we did is that we went to the UN to sort of spread this idea and see how it can be international. So we were asked to join the Together campaign. And here's the first delegation. Here's the second delegation to the UN. You'll recognize Amelia and Kathleen. There's Kathleen talking about the eCar Minor. There's Angela. There's the third delegation. Lots of fantastic people here. And that's the last slide. It gives you just some contact information and some places where you can check out stories. But, I want to make sure that I give at least 5 minutes for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Diya. Yeah, questions? Comments, Diya?
I was gonna say, I just had a comment. I just like the dynamic of eCar and like what you stand for as a professor, like giving Black and brown people kind of a voice. So I feel like it is definitely hard to talk about certain things because I feel like in so many ways we have so many similarities, but it's very different because with refugees and immigrants, it's a lot. I wouldn't say it's definitely tougher because, we're discriminated against and we have so many injustices that are alike. There's so many things that you guys or, immigrants go through that we have no idea about. So I think it's really important that you have that, that platform.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I ask you something that stuck with me? So I did go to one of the UN summits, and one of the comments or feedback that I got from one of the students who went was that they felt that the UN summits didn't center racism at all. Like at least the summit that we attended didn't really talk about racism, and and she was a student of color, and she felt like that they could have done a better job of like foregrounding experiences of racism, and and I mean it was a short conference, and I wasn't I don't know if I handled it the best in terms of my response to her. You know, I think I said something to the effect of, well, they had limited time, and maybe that wasn't like the focus. It was mostly trying to highlight what educational institutions were doing around refugees, and but it's still like that comment still sticks with me because I feel like I got the sense that she thought um her comment was kind of dismissed, or her feedback was kind of dismissed, and so I was just curious, like like maybe like a praxis oriented approach in the pedagogy of accountability. What would you have, like, could I put you on the spot and say, like, how would you have responded to her feedback about that UN conference?
Yeah. So I thank you for bringing that up, that idea of accountability. I think there's a way in which the UN has consistently not held itself openly. I mean, the UN can only do so much. It's made up of nations who don't want to necessarily hold themselves accountable for why there are so many displaced individuals around the world, and want to see themselves as only offering a solution to a problem rather than dealing with its systemic roots, right? One of which is racism. And so I would say that is not surprising to me, that because racism then it reframes then what we should be doing at the UN at that meeting, right? The point of that meeting is, how do institutions of higher learning, you know, leverage their resources, support, again, framing it as a supportive role, or framing it as philanthropy, framing it as charity, rather than framing it as accountability. Because I think once you start talking about accountability and racism, then the solutions need to look different. And those solutions are not solutions that governments are interested in. So if we're talking about the Palestinian crisis or the Palestinian refugees, that means holding Israel accountable. Who's holding Israel accountable? Nobody. Yeah, so it really is political. I mean, it's political. If you start talking about racism, then you have to start thinking about different solutions. And the countries in power who are perpetuating racism, well, then what? Get out of the room. In fact, that's what happened at the 2018 global compact. Some European countries were like, "Fuck this shit. No, we're not doing anything. Bye."
Alison,
Excuse my language.
Alison,
Is there time for one more question?
yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to like ask kind of like a similar question. I've been like having issues in like a research project that I've been doing around like pain narratives, which is kind of what I feel like you were talking about earlier with like there just aren't like in this narratives that we're collecting, there is not like a place for people to talk about like resilience and things. It's mostly about their experiences. So I was wondering if you had any reflections on research that you've done within ECAR. It looked like from the article, like there had been some sort of like surveys or session, and just like any reflections or like recommendations on making that like not only like an ethical like research, but like research that is like beneficial to all parties and isn't like collecting and like stealing like pain narratives.
Yeah, so the ECAR research that we embarked on was guided by Krista Craven, and it was research that was meant to explore the ways in which campus-based refugee support, refugee resettlement, promoted integration for resettling refugees. And so focusing on the later part of the journey, not the previous part of the journey. So not the trauma, not the traumatic journey, but really their experiences in this country. And of course, they're filled with experiences of resilience and resistance and strength, because that's the refugee story anyway, right? The refugees who are resettled are folks who have resisted and have been resilient in the face of incredible odds. And so the way that we made sure that those were ethical was that we always interviewed folks when they left our campus, which meant that we never asked questions from folks who were our guests, because we understood and knew that you don't ask your guest for something because your guest will have to say yes, right? I mean, they'll sort of like think, oh, is this dependent on me receiving services from you? So it was very clear that we had to do this once folks left ECAR completely. And we also compensated them for their time. And you'd be surprised at how little research is actually compensated. I find that shocking. I mean, I get so many requests at the CNNC for people who want to tap into community center member, like the CNNC serves communities at community centers in large housing complexes in Greensboro. And I get a lot of requests for research to access those communities and ask them questions. And almost never is there, and there's compensation. It's always just, so, making sure that the terms on which the research is happening is one where the person is always comfortable to say no, right? Like that's, so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it would have to, the context would have to be one in which you, the asker, is not someone to whom the person that's being asked is beholden to say yes. And that's so hard when you're in a service provider role and the community sees you as someone who's providing services. It's just so challenging for folks to say no. And then making sure that it's compensated. And, I mean, obviously, I don't know if you have that. I mean, Sonali, you're more of a researcher than I am. So maybe you have some.
No, Alison and I have talked about this before, and I know we're going to talk in a few days as well. So I'm going to Allison, you and I continue to talk about this. And I do want to give you 5 minutes before your next meeting to take a break. And just thank you so much for sharing your insights and your work with us. It's really great and very, very inspiring.
Thank you.
I've listened to you so many times now, and I always leave feeling like very hopeful about the state of the world. So thank you.
Thanks everybody. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.